Donald Trump likely never expected African leaders to push back so strongly and leave him sidelined. A louder and more defiant voice is rising from Africa in a year already filled with major global surprises. But this change didn't come with tanks or dramatic revolutions on TV. Instead, it came with a clear and direct message. Don't interfere with our affairs. That message echoed from dusty army bases in the Sahel to the polished floors of the African Union headquarters. A diplomatic storm is quickly spreading, starting near the Niger River and reaching all the way to the peaks of Mount Kilimanjaro. At the heart of this storm was a tense exchange between U.S. President Donald Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. It wasn't just a clash of policies, it shook the global political scene. What happened wasn't just bold talk. It marked the breakdown of a long-standing global power structure and signaled that Africa was ready to take more control over its own future. A new world order is starting to form, and this time, Africans are helping write the rules. So what really happened behind the scenes? And why are African nations now willing to risk years of diplomatic ties, partnerships, and financial support to finally take a stand? It all came to a head on May 21, 2025, when President Ramaphosa stepped into the Oval Office for what was officially called a friendly meeting about trade and cooperation. But in reality, it turned into a moment that showed just how tense U.S.-Africa relations had become. The conversation took place against the backdrop of South Africa's controversial land reform plan. This policy, which proposed taking land from white owners without paying compensation, was seen by many in the Global South as a long-overdue step to fix injustices from colonial times. However, in the West, especially among conservative groups in the U.S., the plan was seen as harmful to the economy and even racially biased. Trump didn't hold back. According to leaked documents confirmed by Daily Maverick and Le Monde Afrique, he not only criticized the policy, but accused Ramaphosa of becoming a threat to Western investment around the world. But the disagreement went beyond just land issues. Trump also challenged South Africa's support for Palestine and its growing ties with China and Russia, saying these moves hurt American interests. He gave Ramaphosa a choice: change direction or face being cut off diplomatically. Ramaphosa didn't back down. After the meeting, he surprised everyone with a statement. "We value our global relationships, but we won't be told how to run our country, especially by those who can't fix their own problems." His words sparked intense reactions across Africa. In Nigeria, a TV special titled Ramaphosa vs. Trump, a turning point, aired during prime time. Kenya's The Standard newspaper called the event a major step forward for African independence. On social media, many praised Ramaphosa as the leader who spoke for the whole continent. And this wasn't just talk. South Africa took real action. The Foreign Ministry announced that several diplomatic connections with the U.S., including some business and security partnerships, would be paused until both countries could rebuild a relationship based on respect and shared goals. Within just a few days, the foreign ministries of Senegal, Tanzania, and Uganda released statements that echoed the strong stance taken by Ramaphosa. Ghana and other neutral nations also showed quiet support. But the most surprising reaction didn't come from speeches or press conferences. It came from the remote military outposts and dry deserts of the Sahel, where few were paying attention. While South Africa made the diplomatic message clear, the real political shock came from the capitals of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This region of West Africa, once tightly connected to U.S. and French military efforts, began to break away from that influence in early 2025. And then, things changed completely. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, countries not usually seen as major players on the world stage, suddenly became central to a huge shift. Together, they announced the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, a new partnership meant to free them from outside control, especially from military dependence on Western countries. While this move had been quietly building for years, leaders in Washington and Paris didn't see it coming. So what triggered this change? It was years of growing doubt and frustration. The US and France had stationed troops, drones, and intelligence units across the region for over a decade to fight extremists. They spent billions, yet armed groups continued to grow stronger. Entire areas in Mali and Burkina Faso became unsafe. Civilian deaths increased, and local armies remained weak and dependent on outside support. Despite the foreign presence, security didn't improve. Many locals began to feel that these missions were more about control than help. One government spokesperson put it plainly during a TV broadcast on ORTM. The so-called fight against terrorism had become an excuse for foreign interference. "We are not a test site," they said. "We are a sovereign nation." The response was swift. Niger told US troops to leave within 30 days, canceling a key military agreement. American drone bases in Agadez were shut down. The country's own army took over, with reported support from Russian advisors who had recently arrived. After forcing out French forces in 2022, Mali stopped sharing military intelligence with the US and Europe. In their place came Iranian support staff, Turkish weapons specialists, and Russian private military trainers. Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, went even further. He gave Western aid groups just 72 hours to leave conflict areas, blaming them for interference. This wasn't a temporary move, it was a complete shift in policy. These decisions didn't just change who these countries worked with. They reshaped how security worked across the region. And others were quick to fill the gap left by the West. Russia stepped in, supplying weapons, armored trucks, electronic warfare tools, and drones. Their military instructors were spotted running training camps near Gao and Wahiguya. China, which had stayed out of the Sahel's military issues, moved into infrastructure deals, winning telecom and railway contracts across the three countries in just a few months. Turkey and the UAE also saw opportunities. They began offering military help bundled with business deals, cell phone towers, construction projects, and mosque restorations. What mattered most to the Sahel leaders? These new partners didn't ask about elections, human rights, or how the countries ran their governments. They didn't show up with lectures, they showed up with deals. The Sahel countries didn't just walk away from their old Western partners. They quickly built new alliances, this time shaped around their own urgent needs. But these bold moves didn't happen in isolation. What had gone down in Washington just days earlier gave their actions even more weight. Ramaphosa's firm stance made the Sahel's decisions feel justified, like the green light they had been waiting for. His words spread like a signal of approval. Africa is done being pushed around. Now the continent has the strength, the influence, and the partnerships to back that up. And no Western politician seemed able to stop the flames that had sparked in the White House and swept across the Sahel. And this was only the beginning. Quick message. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about Africa's rise. Now, let's keep going. As military ties with African nations weakened, the US didn't simply accept defeat. It shifted tactics. A quieter, more bureaucratic strategy started to take shape, one that wasn't about boots on the ground or drone strikes. Instead, pressure came through aid conditions and visa policies. From late 2024, the US began tightening visa rules for several African nations, claiming it was due to overstays and national security risks. Visa approvals for students, workers, and visitors dropped sharply in places like Nigeria, Ghana, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. At first, it looked routine, but then many African governments began pulling out of the diversity visa lottery program, the only accessible path for many to legally move to the U.S. The message was clear. Entry into America was no longer a given. It was being treated like a prize. But what was that prize really worth? That question echoed through African government offices. These U.S. decisions were happening at the same time Washington was lobbying for access to rare earth minerals, seeking diplomatic support at the United Nations, and promoting American influence through educational and development programs. African leaders saw the contradiction clearly. In a private African Union meeting, one senior Nigerian official summed it up. They want our minerals, our students, our nurses, and our tech talent, but not our people. Was this supposed to be a partnership, or just another form of exploitation? To many, the visa restrictions felt like quiet retaliation against countries that didn't follow the U.S.'s lead on global issues. But Washington underestimated how united and confident African nations had become. Around the same time as the visa backlash, a new front opened up foreign aid. In 2025, more African countries began turning down or renegotiating U.S. aid, not because they suddenly didn't need the money, but because the political strings attached had become too much. Uganda, for example, walked away from a $300 million U.S. health grant after Washington tried to tie it to changes in security policy and LGBTQ+ rights. Ethiopia rejected a USAID farming project because it required a ceasefire with a rebel group the government considered dangerous. Kenya, once seen as one of America's closest allies in Africa, surprised many by rejecting a US-backed anti-corruption initiative, insisting it would handle its judicial reforms on its own terms. What made these refusals even more striking was that they didn't leave the countries struggling. They opened new doors. Right after rejecting the U.S. offer, Uganda signed a $1.1 billion green energy deal with China, no conditions attached. Kenya and the Gulf Cooperation Council signed an infrastructure agreement worth $4 billion, which includes Saudi Arabian sovereign funding. Ethiopia completed trade corridors with the United Arab Emirates and extended Exim Bank credit lines with India. To put it another way, Washington's tough stance did not compel obedience. It forced African countries to turn to other partners who could provide resources without lecturing. Furthermore, these options did not call for intellectual purity, political alignment, or regime change. American generosity was no longer reflected in immigration and aid programs in that reality. They served as leverage, and Africa was becoming more and more prepared to give it up. And that was evident from what happened subsequently. Immigration laws and U.S. aid were not being rejected in isolation. It was planned, strategic, and strengthened by a newfound sense of continental unity that hadn't been evident since the waves of decolonization in the 1960s. A song of defiance, this time harmonized, echoed louder throughout capitals. President Samia Suluhu Hassan of Tanzania reacted angrily when Western diplomatic missions called for an impartial inquiry into the murders of opposition leaders. In front of Kilimanjaro fans, she posed a scathing query. Should we dispatch our ambassadors to Washington each time a school shooting occurs? The crowd burst out. However, the message did more than just receive praise. It encapsulated the diplomatic uprising of 2025. Reciprocity. African leaders could no longer stand moral lecturing from countries mired in their own problems. It was time to stop being treated like a student in a lecture hall. The new position was obvious. You have no right to hold us to the standards you set if you don't hold yourself to them. A continent-wide renaissance suddenly centered on the African Union, which had previously been derided for being a toothless bureaucracy. In a landmark decision adopted in April 2025, the AU rejected conditional aid, affirmed non-interference as a fundamental principle, and endorsed multipolar diplomacy, urging members to pursue balanced alliances with South American blocs, China, Russia, India, and the Arab League. In the same month, AU leaders unanimously decided to intensify their push for reform of the UN Security Council, calling for the elimination of the exclusive Western veto system and at least 2 permanent African seats. Africa was not requesting a place at the table for the first time in its history. It was creating its own. There were specific actions taken. To lessen reliance on the US dollar for cross-border trade, Nigeria, Ghana, and Rwanda started a continental digital currency trial called AfriCoin. With the support of Chinese and Turkish investors, the Trans-Sahelian Energy Corridor, a large cooperative investment effort involving Mali, Algeria, and Niger, was approved. Pan-African media coalitions, such as a Dakar-based satellite news channel supported by the AU, started to emerge in an effort to refute Western narratives. These weren't just fantasies, they were a rule. Nor did they originate from a remote location. Clarity was the source of them. The planet was no longer unipolar. Africa didn't have to pick between Beijing and Washington. It would and could make its own decisions. But there was a price for choosing oneself, and nowhere was that cost more apparent than in the way the balance of power in the world was changing. African countries now show what the United States formerly believed to be loyalty, strategic patience. After decades of conditional aid, military interventions, and economic impositions, that patience ultimately gave out in 2025. And there has been seismic fallout. The United States' influence is waning throughout the continent due to competition rather than coups or war. Chinese tech parks, Russian military trainers, and BRICS trade corridors are quickly replacing the soft power that America once possessed through training programs, Hollywood, and charity. The Cold War is not new. Washington is in a worse situation, because African countries are not battlefields as they formerly were. Negotiators are what they are. Currently, 30% of Africa's new energy infrastructure is funded and constructed by China. Since 2023, Russia, which was formerly sidelined, has signed more than 25 defense cooperation agreements. In addition to controlling an increasing portion of the world's non-dollar trade, BRICS Plus has suggested creating its own development bank to compete with the IMF, with equal voting rights for African members. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to follow its outdated strategy. Washington Post op-eds bemoaning diminished influence, sanctions, and veiled threats. However, it is not African haughtiness that is the issue. It's amnesia in Americans. The United States failed to remember that influence is temporary. It needs to be valued and earned. Furthermore, without waiting for U.S. approval, Africa is already making agreements, constructing infrastructure, and creating the frameworks of the next financial system, while Washington continues to argue whether to interact with the continent. A multipolar movement has emerged from what was originally a unipolar period. Furthermore, Africa does not play a supporting role in that narrative. It is a co-author. You see, 2025 won't go down in history as a year of diplomatic squabbling. It will go down in history as the year that Africa truly said no. Africa is no longer begging, as seen by the Sahel's military reorientation, the AU resolutions, the BRICS bank designs, the visa wars, and Ramaposa's defiance in the Oval Office. It's a negotiation. It's constructing. It is placing a wager on itself. Thus, there is no clearer message for the West, and particularly for the United States. Be respectful if you want partnerships. Continue walking if you desire obedience. The United States expected Africa to follow for decades. Africa is no longer trailing in 2025. It's taking the lead with whoever is listening, on its own terms and at its own speed. Therefore, whether Africa is rising is not the question. That has already been addressed. Who is prepared to rise with it, though? And who is going to be abandoned? What are your thoughts? Will the United States abstain from meddling in African domestic affairs? Or do you think the tampering will only change forms and never stop? What do you think would happen if all African leaders took a united stance, similar to that of the EU presidents? Let us know in the comments area below. Will they be able to withstand Western threats and pressure? Would you like to see more videos similar to this one? If so, click the bell icon next to it and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for viewing, and be sure to check back for the next video.